if psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird.
From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. We have a fantastic show for you. Our trending topic today is the erosion of science. We're going to talk about anti-vaxxers, the measles outbreak, flat earthers, and more. A hot one. But first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Dr. Emma Kate Wright is here. Emma Kate, when you were in school, were you a science person? Were you a bit of a science nerd? Did you like the sciences?
Yes. So I actually thought at one point I was going to go into test development, which is all about statistics and trying to measure behaviors. And then I realized I like people too much.
And then what?
And then I decided to be a psychologist instead.
After you partied a lot.
I played, but I also worked hard.
Play hard, work hard. Well, you just heard Dr. Frank Gaskell. He's also with us. And Frank, I know you were and are a science nerd.
Big time.
So how did that start for you?
Well, it really began with a show called The Undersea Adventures of Jacques Cousteau. And I used to live in a country called Iran, and we could only get 3 shows there for 4 years.
But you had a driver.
And it was Space 1999, so Space.
And you
And
played
then-
in a palace.
The Undersea Adventures of Jacques Cousteau, which is, science. And then Cooking with Julia Childs. And so I had my National Geographic magazines, and I would learn, and I'd try to stay away from the African naked pictures. That's it.
Did you cook for yourself, though?
I did think, my mom did.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where are you going with that, Emma Kate?
I don't know. I was just thinking about all the things that were very luxurious over there. Things were not always luxurious, but just kind of interesting.
It was Iran. Yeah.
Such as it was.
Such as it was.
Well, if you're watching us on the YouTube channel, you realize that Jonathan Hedderly's not with us. He apparently didn't get his vaccines, and so we have banned him from the studio. But
Yeah,
Yep.
He's living in a bubble.
yes, Bubble Boy. But we are going to talk about the erosion of science, and we're going to dive right into our trending topic today. So the big theme is that it appears that there is a trend in our society to be anti-science or to reject the findings of science. And so you've got this reemergence of people who believe the earth is flat. You have a big movement against vaccinations. You have people in some quarters that deny the things like evolution. So it seems like that's always been an undercurrent, but it has bubbled up to the surface in a big way in probably the last 2 years, maybe more. First, do you agree with that assumption, Emma Kate? And if so, why do you think that is?
So I agree that there is to some extent, an erosion of science, an erosion of the belief in science, because we are definitely seeing a lot of things being discredited. But at the same time, I also feel like the media takes kind of rare instances and kind of blows them up so that it's in people's awareness. But I think people inherently do trust science as a whole. It's just maybe there's a lack of trust in scientists. I'm not sure.
Frank?
I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and this sort of anti-science, anti-vaxxer, all that kind of stuff is nothing new. I mean, it's been around since, 1500s, 1600s, primarily based out of religion, believing that the Earth was the center of our solar system. But I think it's changed dramatically with the advent of social media, because people can just sort of listen to what they want to listen. But also, it's like what Emma Kate said. Okay, butter's not good for you. Okay, butter is good for you. And sort of that scientific method of change. Now we believe this, now we believe that. But I think the other piece of this, what you said, Dave, the last 2 years, is we now have a leader who is believing these things and making it okay to believe in these things.
So I would suggest it goes back even a little further than that. And I mean, I know that this undercurrent's been there for forever, but I think even preceding that, and I'm going to float a theory. You tell me if you buy this. I think that there has been this movement about climate change where 97% of scientists say, or of climate change scientists, people in that or related fields have that consensus, and it bucks up against certain people's political, and I'll say political, not scientific, views. And so there has been a really strong effort to push back hard against that because it doesn't square with someone's kind of political ideology. And I think that's been maybe the origin of what we're seeing now, where it's kind of all bubbled up to the surface in a big way. Would you buy that?
I would, especially for the climate change piece. I feel like religion might play a different role for other things like anti-vaccination stuff. So like the measles outbreak that's happened in New York recently, it's occurring predominantly in children of the Orthodox Jewish community. And I need to do a little bit more research on it, but there could be aspects related to their religion where maybe they decide they don't want to vaccinate their kids. But I think you're on to something where definitely our political beliefs, our personal beliefs, our religious beliefs are going to shape and influence how we take in and believe information.
I actually I read an article about this stuff, and the authors broke it down to you've got these different things that interfere with our ability to believe in science, and it's political ideology, religiosity, morality, and knowledge. And religiosity has the lowest trust in science, but the political piece for climate change, in my opinion, is about money. So you have the conservative people that have all these regulations saying, we don't need to regulate coal, we need to regulate this, and they're just going to go where the money is, not where the science or the belief is. But the other troubling part of this, scientists do believe there's global warming, but there's not consensus necessarily on what causes it. And also, actually, one of the things that they speak to is this massive farming and how cows are burping out methane and all that kind of stuff, which I think is probably contributing for sure. But who's going to get on board with that and say, yeah, we got to stop farming cattle? It's not going to happen.
Right. So what do you think the psychology that is underneath this is in the current climate that drives somebody? Because it's not arguable that science in many ways has made our lives longer. Now, we could argue about whether it's made them better, but it has certainly made our lives longer. It has definitely eradicated certain conditions or diseases. I mean, that's inarguable. What do you think it is that drives people to psychologically to be anti-science? We'll use that term broadly.
Well, I think it really depends on the actual question. So, or in terms of the actual research itself. So there's something called cognitive dissonance, which is a really well-known theory in the psychology field so in general, people like consistency. We like our worldview to stay the same and have our same beliefs upheld. And so cognitive dissonance occurs when there's a situation that conflicts with your beliefs or your attitudes or your behaviors. And essentially, you start to become uncomfortable with that. And so to help feel better about it, then you have to change a behavior or change a belief. There has to be some sort of adjustment. So, for example, with vaccinations, a parent might hear about how, vaccines are safe, but they're worried about how it could harm their child. So then they change their adjustment, and they make that adjustment and say, oh, well, I don't think they work. So then they have this new belief to help kind of resolve that dissonance, that discomfort. So I definitely think what happens is people really just want to keep the status quo, and that makes sense because it's uncomfortable. Again, I keep just saying that word, uncomfortable, because it sucks. We don't like being challenged, and we don't like things changing, and that's just the nature of life, though. Life is always changing.
Yeah, and when we reason things out, we're very quickly pushing emotion into it, and that emotion makes reasoning more difficult, which then ends up with us rationalizing. And having that, there was a guy in Tennessee who was running against vaccinations for autism. And at some point he said, when I win, I'm going to go down to the CDC. I'm going to jump up and down on that table and say, show me the real data. And so you make up this information in order to keep the idea in your mind. And so Francis Bacon, who's big in the scientific method, has a great quote that he said, science, its purpose is to go after the idols of the mind, which is great. Because that's this idea about when you're throwing the data out, you're just going to hold on to this belief at all costs, and you're going to make the data fit your little confirmation bias.
Well, and I also think there's another really important area, too. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the availability heuristic. So essentially, it's whenever there's information, so the accuracy, your belief on the accuracy of something, the likelihood of it happening is really influenced by how easily you can recall information about that or how easily it comes to your mind. So just as a random example, because I've had a house fire, I might say, oh, house fires are really likely, even though the odds of that actually happening to people are much lower. And I do think the media is playing a role in this aspect because they're more likely to bring up the things that are rare because it's sensational and people are going to be interested in that.
You lead with the fire.
Well, and I think that's where a lot of, especially with the anti-vaccine stuff, that, they ran with Andrew Wakefield. He, I guess I should maybe clarify because this is a really important study. So 1998, I think, is that right? Wakefield published that in the Lancet?
I
can't remember the exact date,
right.
but it was like 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And Wakefield basically said that the MMR vaccine was going to cause and related to autism. And the media took that and they ran with it and they used what information they wanted from that without taking some really important stuff into account. So first of all, Wakefield's study was a case report. So it wasn't a randomized trial. It wasn't controlled. He had 12 people, 12. And it also came out after the fact that he fabricated data. I mean, he made up data. And, shocker, he had a conflict of interest related to money. So, I think what we have to do is build a better relationship with the public and with the media to help them understand these are the things that you need to be looking for within research as opposed to just some weak scientific method-based study that seems interesting, because there's a really huge responsibility for the media as well as researchers to be making sure that we're putting accurate and helpful information out there. I went on my soapbox. I'm done.
There are flat earther conventions, and the other piece of this, not just with social media, but who you become friends with. You're gonna collect the other wackos that believe in this stuff. And the mental gymnastics that these flat earthers go through is astounding. So what's at the edge of the earth? Well, we can't get there, but we're surrounded by ice walls, much like Game of Thrones, but the military is posted just out of range of the ice wall to turn you back so you can't get there. Like, no, that seems very believable to me.
Plausible. Very plausible.
I can really get behind that. Mm-hmm. But the interviews with these convention people, they're poorly educated and usually homeschool parents. No offense to homeschool. I'm a fan of homeschool, but they have these just bizarre beliefs and live in these small communities where you're just going to believe what your neighbor believes.
So this is really where I want to go with this. I've known about this flat earth thing and even the anti-vaxxer thing for a long time, but particularly the anti-vaxxer thing. The one thing that I did not realize, and it has only probably in the last 6 months become something I've become aware of, is not just that people are anti-vaccination, but they will fight you to the death.
Yep.
And that it is like the level of hostility and rage. And so, I'm going to make an interesting connection here. So when we did the Michael Jackson podcast, we got a lot of views on that. We got a lot of downloads on that, but we also got a ton of downvotes on it. And it was all from people that were like, how dare you, believe these guys. Michael Jackson did good things for the world. And, it was very much, but there was a level of hostility about it, which we expected. But the anti-vaxxers are probably as bad or worse in that regard. A little anecdote on my Facebook feed, there's one person that's a Facebook friend who is a generally moderate, even-keeled person, except on this issue, and then will post insane things and very sort of angry, hostile, attacking. And there's all these other stories about doctors getting all this hate mail, calling them baby killers and all this kind of stuff. So I have my theory about this, but what's your take on why the level? It's like, okay, you don't want to vaccinate your kids. I mean, it does have some broader implications for the community, but really that's a view that you're holding. Why be so hostile about it?
When I look, I have pity on some level for anti-vaxxers. And most of the time, my personal encounter with them is one of two things. And when it's combined, it's even worse. So there's a lot of religiosity, which is fear of science, doubting of science. There's a little foundation there. But then having a child on the spectrum it can be really difficult. And then you're wanting a solution. You're wanting a fix, a change. And it's got to be a thing rather than it's DNA, it's inherited. They can't believe that, because if they believe that, then it's their fault and they can't go there.
Or there's not anything they can do about it.
Yes.
Right. It's out of control. So I agree with aspects of that. And then I'll add, when it comes to the safety of your children, I mean, it's just straight up instinct. Mama bear is going to come out where you are going to fight tooth and nail for what is best for your offspring. I mean, I think we can boil it down to that too.
And most of the anti-vaxxers that I see on my Twitter feed are moms struggling with a kid on the spectrum, or it's that echo chamber that they're in, that this is just the way it is.
Yeah, but even then you hear these stories of these families where, whether it's a recency thing where, okay, so they maybe had some signs of autism before they got the vaccine or shortly after they got the vaccine, and then they just attribute the cause and effect to be those two things, or to be the vaccine itself. So they have these unbelievable stories that they're sharing with everyone about how horrible this experience was, and yet, there's not a lot of science to support that.
It makes me crazy seeing all these diseases coming back. I mean, it's a freak show out there. In North Carolina last year, we had this massive outbreak of chickenpox, and it was out of one particular school that was a religious school. And there you go.
I'm going to share recent data that was released by the World Health Organization on measles. They found that from the first 3 months of 2019 compared to the first 3 months of 2018, measles cases rose by 300%. And so literally the numbers for 2018 were 28,000 cases. This year it was 112,000 cases. So, when we talk about the erosion of science, I mean, for people to not take this stuff seriously, there are really severe implications. And that's why, for example, with the whole Wakefield thing, when you're a researcher, our number one goal is to do no harm. And there are true ethical implications associated with anything that's released and anything that's published. So I get pissed off, truthfully, and that's why I just keep going on my little tirade here. But, it just makes me angry that people will just do fraudulent things for the sake of getting their name out there, notoriety. But the thing I do love about the scientific community is that if somebody puts something out, others are going to want to replicate it. And they're going to want to say, yes, let's support you in this, or let's debunk it. And you can't question that. So if there's consensus on research surrounding a particular topic, then odds are really high that it's an accurate representation of what's going on.
Okay, so you guys put 3 things out there. I'm going to put a 4th thing out there, and you tell me if you buy this. The 3 things you put out there that contribute to not just being what we're calling anti-science, but being very vehement and hostile in that respect. One is religious views that don't square with it. Having a child on the spectrum where you're desperate for answers, or I would say at any condition, any condition that a child has that you're desperate for answers. A third that Emma Kate's saying is related to just taking care of your kids, anything that makes you fearful that you're going to get more hostile about. But here's the other place that I would go with it is it also feels like the less defensible a position is, the more you have to amp up the intensity of the argument. In other words, if you've got if the balance of the data is not in your favor, you've got to come out kicking and screaming and scratching and the whole bit. You have to rampage because you can't quietly have that argument and win it. You can't quietly sort of in a deliberate way put your position out there and win that argument because the information's not on your side. Would you buy that?
Yeah.
I buy that, and I'm going to say something controversial.
Oh, boy.
And hopefully not offending a community. But there's another piece to this that I think is central to the idea of autism. And I've encountered this because Asperger's, the spectrum, it's my specialty, that some moms who are on the spectrum can get really hyper-focused and fixated on an idea and on a belief. And it's very black and white. It's this, it's not that. And it's hard to shift on that. And then that becomes your special interest and your special focus. Then it's hard to go up against that. And you're more likely to have that kind of mom or dad if you've got a kid on the spectrum. So then those things kind of align to allow you to get stuck on a belief.
So one more piece of this that we haven't touched on yet, but we talk about social media on this podcast a lot. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like social media, not just the mainstream media, et cetera, but social media in particular, plays a significant role in firing this stuff up? And that we might not be having the intensity of some of this stuff if it weren't for the prominence of that. I know that's a leading question, but how do you see that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, no question.
Think about the titles that people will use, and people half the times they don't even read the article. They just click the like button or they tweet it, retweet it, and they don't actually take the time to look at it. Mm-hmm. So, hands down.
And if we go back, I don't know how many years, to the 80s, I guess, we had the 3 newscasts that last a half hour, and we had a newspaper. So you could dump a story like this out there, and it's not going to get a whole lot of traction. People would say, oh, okay.
Yeah. So last question, then we're going to wrap this up. This has big implications in some respects. Obviously, if someone's not vaccinating their kids, and then other people in that community don't in the same school, then you have an outbreak of chickenpox or measles or whatever. some, of course, in the anti-vax community would say, well, I'd rather have that than suffer the consequences of the vaccine. But it does affect other people. So when you live in a community, you have to make decisions that are good for the whole community. But my broader question is it a big deal that there are people that are not listening to science, that they don't believe in evolution, that they think the earth is flat, that they, fill in the blank, whatever, that don't believe in climate change? Can they just be left alone and there's no real larger implication of that? Or is it a bigger deal?
I think it's a very big deal. And the science community has always been about, or not always, it has been saying, well, we need to do more science to prove science to the people so they'll believe in science. But the real thing that I think needs to be done is people like Neil deGrasse Tyson. There need to be science prophets that go out there and they demonstrate how the scientific method works, what it means to demystify it, to popularize it. So not only is it dangerous, but imagine being one of these moms or dads, you didn't vaccinate your kid, and now they've got the measles. And how do you reconcile that? You say, well, I did that, but they're going to do that mental gymnastic that says, well, at least they don't have autism. But I think it's really dangerous, and I don't really know what to do about it. I think Trump has magnified it, to be honest.
Well, and I do agree that there are certain figures right now that are really intensifying this and creating divisiveness. But I think it's critical because we have a social responsibility. I mean, if there's information out there or there's some sort of treatment or whatever it is that's based in research that's going to help people, who are we to sit there and not try to get that word out there? Like I'm speaking from, and I'm owning my bias in the sense that I am a cancer survivor, and I would be dead truly if it wasn't for research and science. And and I also think too about people who are immunocompromised, and there are all sorts of things. But again, bringing it back to this responsibility, where if we have information or if we have knowledge help, why would we just not at least attempt to share that? So I don't think it's okay for us to just say, all right, whatever, you guys believe whatever you believe. At least have some sort of effort or initiative to attempt to put that information out there and then let people make their own choices. And if they make the choice that they make, that's on them.
All right. We're going to wrap it up, and we want to ask you how you feel about this topic. How do you feel about anti-vaxxers? Or if you are an anti-vaxxer, what mean, angry thing do you want to say to us?
Please
genuine,
troll us.
Or genuine feedback so we can have conversation.
Sure. Yeah, genuine conversation.
Or mean and angry thing.
Yeah, let's go with that.
That's what I'm expecting.
So you can let us know. You can tweet us at shrink_tank or write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. Our final segment, something that we call Doctor's Orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture that we want to recommend to you. Emma Kate.
So, given that there's a lot of climate talk today, I am going to recommend a Netflix show called Our Planet. So it was released on April 5th. And for those of you who really enjoyed Planet Earth, Blue Planet, those sorts of shows, this is narrated by David Attenborough, so it sounds lovely. And the cinematography is awesome. And it really just talks about the fragility of our Earth. And it's beautiful.
Is that the one with the walruses?
Maybe.
Yeah. Just an alert.
Well, I was going to say that as well.
It's very, very controversial.
Just that one part.
Because the one part. But when you don't know it's there, you can't unsee it. And it's really, really sad. So
maybe don't watch the walrus part.
When it comes to the walrus section, just hit fast forward.
Walrus on the cliff.
Yeah. Don't.
All right.
But it's still really pretty.
Yeah.
All right, Frank.
I want to. There's a person in history, his name's Henry Cavendish, and he was probably the most amazing scientist who ever lived. He was definitely on the spectrum, which I find fascinating that a guy like this invents the scientific method and he's the first guy to weigh the earth, which how do you even do that? But he did it. And there is a massive 800-page book called Cavendish, The Experimental Life, which you are not going to want to read. But I do want you to read Neurotribes, which I have recommended before, by Steve Silberman, where he spends a good deal of time talking about Cavendish and also speaks toward the vaccine autism movement. And it's literally one of the best books I've ever read. It's big, but it's an easy read. And again, that's Neurotribes by Steve Silberman.
My favorite reality show just started back up this week. It's the
Real Housewives?
Nope. The Amazing Race.
Oh, boy.
And it's a great season. They've got reality stars like Rupert from Survivor and his wife are on it, and some other folks that you probably would recognize. It just started this week, so if you jump in, not too late. Very, very good season ahead. The Amazing Race, my favorite reality show. Watch it.
And the reality show that you and I applied to be on.
That's true. Frank and I did apply
about
to
that.
Amazing Race about it. It's been a while ago.
A million years ago.
I forgot about that.
Yes, we sure did. I think I could do Amazing Race. Survivor, Frank has always said that if I went on Survivor, there'd be one of two outcomes. I would either drown in the first episode, getting off the boat, or I'd win the whole thing. And I think that's a pretty fair summary of it. Mm-hmm. But Amazing...
Dave, if you can't walk 10,000 steps like in January,
Thank you.
How would you ever complete the Amazing Race?
And how you can't find your way outside a paper bag.
Mm-mm.
I think it would make for good television.
They did not make it to the show, obviously.
You'd die in a fiery car wreck.
It's possible.
Yeah.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. If you like this episode, please make sure you give us a 5-star rating on iTunes and tell your friends to subscribe. This really helps our podcast grow, and we really appreciate it. And for more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, you can visit shrinktank.com. We have great articles and videos and a lot more on shrinktank.com. You can also find links to some of our Doctor's Orders products so you can check them out yourself. Follow us on Twitter at @shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. For our loyal listeners, be sure to check out the video version of this podcast on our YouTube channel by searching Shrink Tank. If you're watching us on YouTube, we'd love for you to subscribe. You can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever else you're listening. And for questions or comments, drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright and Frank Gaskell in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Please tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.